Hello and welcome, or welcome back as the case may be. Here we go again. Why would I have another capacitor tester on the bench? Especially after I've tested several of these and I have repeatedly come back to where the old Heathkit C2 is my favorite. My Sencor still sits up there on the bench, mostly unused. That's only there to impress the clients. That guy is sitting right there, and it's just a pain in the neck to use compared to the C2. The C2 is so much quicker and easier to use. I had a solar examiner. I had the model CE, which is this unit here, and sold it off because I said at the time it was a pain in the ass to operate. All the push buttons and switch combinations that were needed to operate the thing, and it didn't do anything any better than the Heathkit did. The only advantage this had was it had a megger built into it, and it will test approximately up to 10 giga-ohms of leakage. Well, the Heathkit will do the same thing, and something I meant to mention last time when we were talking about the C2, Mr. Carlson's new unit will show leakage just by holding the test leads in your hand. Well, the C2 will do it as well, especially with the new, I hope you can see that blinking away merrily and the blinking going on occasionally over there on the front of the C2. Just by holding the rubber test leads in my hand, there's enough leakage through these rubber coverings to build up enough voltage to trigger the test lamp. So the C2 is very reliable for finding leakage. This beast here, well, let's start out with the schematic for the original CE unit here was dated as 1941, the beginning of World War II. The schematic for this guy is dated 1946, the end of World War II. The only reason I can see for them changing this form factor and adding a few what I call non-functional additions is they were probably seeing sagging sales and trying to come out with the newest and the greatest. And what they've done over the CE, this is the model CF, they've added 2 quick check terminals down here, where on the original CE unit they were incorporated into the bridge or condenser test. So moving them out now, instead of having 5, you have 7 connections. Ooh, there's an upgrade. The voltage, output voltage, has been set up to have a high and a low range. Why? Other than another switch sure makes it look like it's got more functions. Doesn't add anything to the value of the unit. It still has the same silly, you can see these push buttons on the front for short and volts. They are the most, I don't even know how to describe these things. This unit weighs 12 pounds. Watch what happens when I try to hold the short test button in, or the volts button in, or the low button in. The thing walks across the table. It weighs almost 12 pounds, and it's still, to get the full function of that switch, the thing walks away from you on the table. Why they didn't go to a push down spring-loaded toggle switch or something else, I don't know. It's hard to tell. It looks like the scale may have gotten smaller, but this thing is so much bigger. The CE was literally the size of this piece of paper. That was the form factor. They've made this thing so bloody tall, it might fit under the second shelf on this bench. It won't fit under the shelf I have upstairs for the $10 test bench. And the reason I'm filming down here instead of on the $10 test bench is the lighting and the acoustics are better down here. Another thing, in researching this unit, I came across a picture of one of their very early units, the CB unit, and it's remarkable how similar these two are. Let me turn the camera here a little bit. It looks like Heathkit probably copied the CB. It uses a tuning eye. Now it is on the opposite side. They have exposed the tube they're using for a rectifier through the front so it's accessible. Heathkit just put this circle over here so that the balance, it looks the same on each side. You have the leakage lamp here. You have the function switch here, same function switch, same function, same number of terminals. And we have the power factor knob in the same place on both of them, and the off and on switch in the same place on both of them. They're using a toggle switch. Heathkit went with a slide switch. Now this red light down here in the Heathkit is not original. That was put in there by me to fill a hole that somebody had drilled in the panel at some point in time. That's a shame because this front panel otherwise was pristine. Somebody punched a hole through the front of it. At any rate, I have to believe that the Heathkit was probably a copy of the Solar CB unit. The insides of the thing, I haven't opened this up yet, and we're going to open it up here shortly. The insides of the thing maintain the same sky wiring, or appear to use the same sky wiring that the CE did. It isn't even up to Heathkit standards as far as layout. It's just kind of everything's run from one point to another, point to point. Yes, that's the way things were done in the day, but you would think a commercial piece of gear would have been laid out better. Now, I have not had a Sprague telemic in my hands, but I've got to believe just from looking at the front panel of the telemic that they did a better job of layout. The schematic has been updated. This is the schematic from the CE 1941 vintage, and you can see what they're using for the cathode is like an arc. That's a very archaic way of doing things. This is 1941. If we look at the schematic for the CF, which we have in front of us, we have a much more modern layout of the schematic. They've actually done a nice job on the schematic here. Now somebody's doodled in the margins of this manual. This is an original, or it's not original to this unit, but it is an original manual. And you can see now they've gone to the more conventional cathode form in the schematic, and it's just laid out easier. It's much easier to follow this schematic and read it. This one just kind of meanders all over the surface of the page and trying to track anything down, and this is it really is, you end up with a headache trying to follow the thing. At any rate, I'm going to move the C2 out of the way. We'll be using this shortly to take a look at a couple of the capacitors in the CF here, because I'd like to power it up and see if it functions. Oh, I should also mention these two jacks for the quick check. The CE also has the same quick check function. It's just built into the same bridge terminals. I may not have said that already. And what else? They both functionally they are virtually identical. The specifications are nearly identical, and that's another thing about these old manuals. There is no spec page. You've got to go through the whole thing to get it. But as far as capacitance range, voltage range, resistance tests, virtually identical. There's some very, very minor changes. This one's rated, I think it's 3 megohms to 10 gigohms. The other one was rated 5 gigohms to 10 gigohms, or vice versa. I don't remember, but they're virtually identical. We're going to open this up, take a look at what's inside. Oh, let me back up just a minute here. This quick check function, the old manual for the CE says to use the special test leads for the quick check function. The quick check function is an RF test where you inject RF into the capacitor under test, and it tells you if it's open, shorted, or intermittent. That's all it does. You can test in circuit for open, short, and intermittent. In fact, their big selling point with this was you can even have the radio turned on and active while you're doing the quick check for shorts, opens, or intermittents in the capacitor, which is kind of a neat function, I guess. You don't have to unsolder anything to go in and just do a quick go, no go as to whether or not this particular cap is the problem. But this manual actually spells out the QC465 test leads. They don't tell you what they are. Well, I sniffed around a little while, and there's a patent number on the front here. Patent number 2,271,292. So I went to the U.S. government patent website and punched that in, and they had this schematic. And it's showing the special test leads, and it appears to be ladder line, which makes sense, very low capacitance. And they're showing a double plug here. Now this is not drawn to any kind of scale, but I'm assuming they're meaning this to be the double banana jack, which is on the front of the unit down here. These two here. And if that's the case, if it's to scale, this would be approximately 450 ohm ladder line. Now maybe there was 300 ohm TV line, lead-in line that was ladder line, you know, had the holes in it at one time. I don't know. I've only ever seen the twin lead that was completely flat for TV, or the rounded one that had the foam insulation, or the foam dielectric. But I'm going to try making one of these. I've got a couple of these double banana jacks that you can screw to, and there's a place where I can tie wrap ladder line to. And I've got some 16 gauge stranded wire ladder line, 450 ohm, and I think I'll try making up this test lead and see if I can get this balanced oscillator to balance. And if it does, I'll be able to do in-circuit testing. Will I ever use it? I don't know. It'll be a fun experiment. And you'll see this is also a fairly old patent. This is 1940. This was probably done for the original CE unit. And here again they're using the arced cathode. They're using what appears to be, you know, a full wave rectifier, a triode, and I'm guessing that is an I tube. In fact, let me look up the schematic. Hang on just a second. Alright, I've gone back and pulled up the actual patent text to see if I could glean any more information out of it, and there's actually a good theory of operation in here on the operation of the quick check function. And for those of you who'd like to look this up and read it for yourselves, it's patent number 2,271,292. And if you go to the official U.S. government patent office website, this is free. You just punch that patent number in, and this will pop up. And it tells me that this is indeed an I tube. It tells me this is the 6F6, the same 6F6 that they're using in this unit for the VTVM, as well as the oscillator. They're using this as an oscillator, as a second one in here for the VTVM function, which incidentally is just as clunky on this one as it was on the CE. And it doesn't mention anything about the rectifier. The CE and the CF don't have a dedicated rectifier tube. They use a 6L6 as a combination rectifier and voltage control. So it does its own rectification, half-wave rectification, and there's a potentiometer on the grid to control the output voltage here. But this part of the circuit is essentially the same. This was just an early patent when they were developing this. Now, I should also mention I paid way too much for this unit. I can only say I'm a sucker for capacitor analyzers for turn of the century or turn of the 1940s, 50s test equipment. I'm a little concerned about the condition. In the photographs on the website, it looked like all of this was rust, and it just turns out to be the paint's flaking off. So we'll have to remove the front panel and sand this down and repaint it. The leather handle is intact, although it's starting to crack, and I wouldn't trust it to carry this unit, but I'll leave it on there because it's original and it looks decent. But what concerns me on this is the bottom. That's very heavily pitted rust. Now, it's there and it's up the sideways as if this has been immersed a little bit in water, and that concerns me because if the wafer switch that's in here, if it's the same thing that was in the CE unit, and I'm assuming it's very similar, it's going to be one of those phenolic type switches, which can absorb moisture and absorb iron oxide from the rust, and could totally destroy the functionality of the leakage tester. Remember, this is a 10 gig ohm class meter, and well, we'll see when we get in there. It comes apart the same as the other unit. The CE model had this cord coming out the opposite side, but they do that because it's designed to lay on its back as well as stand up, so the cord's on the side. It has the same front panel arrangement, with the front panels held on with a series of screws. Those little rusty screws will have to be replaced, and it appears the unit comes apart by taking out the screws around the outside edge. They have brought both of the trimmer capacitors, or access to both of the trimmer capacitors, out the side here so that you can balance the quick check bridge. On the CE unit, you had to open it up to do that. Here they gave you access on the side, and they told you which one's which. So when we repaint this, we'll have to put a label here for C13 and C6. I'll probably use my brother label maker. Okay, enough yakking. Let's see what's inside of this. We'll take the screws out and take a look. Okay, first impressions. The inside of the cabinet's not rusty, just the outside. So maybe we got lucky and this was just sitting on a damp basement floor. It still doesn't mean that the switch is any good, but perhaps not as bad as I initially had thought. Let's try to get some light on the subject here. Somebody, it appears, has replaced the electrolytics at some point in time. These are fairly new compared to the rest of the unit. These are covered with mold. As you can see, all the white powder on there. I'm probably going to die some horrible disease from breathing that, but so be it. We'll get all of those capacitors changed out. We'll take a couple of quick checks and see if we can safely power this up, get an initial feel for it. Oh, the power transformer has got the voltages marked on the side of it. That's fairly unusual for this vintage. It appears somebody has scabbed in a couple of dial lamps. They are taking advantage of the existing holes that are in here. Now, whether or not this was done, it's the same cotton covered wire that the rest of the unit is wired together with, but the schematic doesn't show these. The schematic makes no mention of these. The parts list makes no mention of it. I should add, a couple thousand of these at least were built, but I've only ever seen one of this model. Just going by the serial numbers, at least a couple thousand of these were built. We've got some coating chipping off of that resistor. We'll have to go through here, check all the resistors, check the capacitors. I'm hoping against hope that this switch isn't too badly contaminated. And I took a quick look in here in between videos, and if I want a ceramic switch, this has got 6 decks and 11 positions from a US manufacturer. I can get them. It's about a $200 unit. So I did some more quick searches, and AliExpress, there's a Chinese outfit which will sell me a 6-deck 11 position ceramic switch for about $9. So if this proves to be unserviceable, we have a backup plan to replace that with a ceramic switch. As much as I don't want to buy from China, I'm not about to spend $200 to try to restore something of this condition. This is not a museum piece, it's just simply an old capacitor tester. Wow, the RF coil is all covered with mold. And we'll have to do some careful cleaning in here and some capacitor replacement. The 6L6 has obviously been changed at some point in time. I actually expected to see something of this shape for the 6L6, but this appears to be a fairly modern, quote-unquote, probably 60s vintage, 50 or 60s vintage 6L6. The tubes will have to all be tested. We'll take a quick look at some of the capacitors and see if we can safely fire this up. Alrighty, here's where we stand after some checks. The two 6J5s test like they're brand spanking new. The 6L6 that was in here had a very heavy heater to cathode leak, and I took a quick look at the schematic for that tube, or for that part of the circuit, and it's working here. The 6L6 has got its own dedicated filament winding, so I said, no big deal. They're using it as a rectifier and as the voltage control, but with an isolated filament winding, it won't be a big deal. So I went ahead and tested the emission, and it was flatlined, so it's gone. Fortunately, I have a fairly decent stock of poles on 6L6s, and I've got one here that tests almost new. So the 6L6 is replaced. The two 6J5s are fine. I went ahead and I didn't even bother checking the electrolytics, which had been replaced at some point in time with these Sanpo, and they looked just old enough that I said, I'm pulling them out, and I replaced them with a couple of brand new NTE replacements. It calls for 2.8 microfarad 350 volt in series. That way you end up with 4 microfarad at 700 volts, because the unit runs at about 600 volts. I had 10 microfarad 450 volt, so I'm good for 900 volts, and instead of, it will be up to 5 microfarads instead of 4, which will be fine. That's not going to hurt a thing. I did a quick run through of the other capacitors in the unit, and just remember, I'm just going to power this up to test the thing. These two domino capacitors here are probably paper, and they are quite leaky, but they're not shorted. This paper cap, that paper cap, all leaky. This bridge capacitor here, which is 4 microfarad at 100 volts, it's leaking, not horribly, but it will get replaced. However, this 0.02 microfarad is virtually a dead short. Now let's see if we can get the, we've got the meter in frame as well. This is R times 1, and right up to the end of the scale. So that one is absolutely a dead short. Now that's in the AC VT VM input, so I just disconnected it for now. Don't really care. We're not going to be even checking that function. Everything else, while leaky, is not dangerously so. So we can go ahead and turn this thing on. Oh, and by the way, I did another look through here at the circuitry, and I replaced the one bad dial lamp. The other one was working, is fine. But down here is a little terminal strip that has been added at some point in time. You can tell the soldering is a little bit fresher than everything else in the unit. So these dial lamps were added by some owner at some point in time, although he did have the correct cotton covered wire, and it actually, if on closer examination, you can see this has a waxy surface. This is very dry. So the wire is period correct. It is not original, but period correct. Somebody at some point in time added a couple dial lamps so they could tell the unit was on, probably by looking at the meter. I think I'm going to leave them in. Like I say, it's period correct, and it's something that a lot of techs would have done back in the day, so I'm just going to leave it in there. I can't see any harm in leaving it behind. I'm going to slip this partially here into its case, and we'll turn it on and see what we've got. Be back in a sec. Okay, we slid the unit back into its case just so that it would stand up for the purpose of the video. We're down here at the main bench, so we don't have my Heathkit isolation transformer and variac, so we're using an isolation transformer that's down on the floor that'll handle about 1,000 watts. We've got a variac and we have a current meter. It's a kilowatt, but it'll work for the current just to keep an eye on things. And we'll turn things on and see what we get. I'm going to move the camera here a little bit. Hope that's not too shaky for you. And we'll see what we get. Let's see if we can get the meter with a little less reflection. That looks a little better. Okay, I am going to turn the unit on. Ooh, that sounds a little crunchy, but we'll have to investigate that. Turn the variac on. Okay, the variac is hot, and we're going to start advancing. 20 volts, 40 volts, and we'll let it sit there for a minute, and I'll take a look at the current. And it's virtually drawing nothing yet, a little bit. Yeah, we're drawing 100 milliamperes at the moment. Can't see any dial-light activity yet. We'll let it sit there for a minute. That current's dropping off, so the tube filaments are starting to heat up a little bit. Let's bring it up to about 60 volts here. Come on, volts. Wrong button. There we go. Alright, there's 60 volts. And we're still drawing 100 milliamperes. So far everything's good. I can see the dial lights glowing in there, so that's a good sign. No activity. Oh, yep, the voltage is starting to come up. That means the rectifier is working. And it's continuing to climb. We're still at 100 milliamperes at 60 volts of input. There's 100 volts of DC. Climbing up on 200. Alrighty, I'm going to go back here and let's bring the voltage up to about 80 volts. There's 81. 170 milliamperes. I'm happy with that. I'm surprised the voltage hasn't really swung up a lot more. We're on the high volt setting. Oh, I'm not on. There we go. Yeah, let's do this. Alright, there's 200 volts. We're on the mega range, so I'm going to bring this thing right up and see what happens. There's 90, there's 115 right there. Oh, now it's starting to wake up. Still only seeing 300 volts on the gauge here. Let's see if we go to leakage. Leakage, here we go. Oh, there we go. There's our 600 volts. Okay, so we're getting our full 600 volts out of the power supply, as I'd hoped. That would be used for testing leakage, normal leakage tests, or for reforming your capacitor. So we've got 600 volts there. Now if I go back down here to the mega ohms, that should come all the way up to the top of the scale, and it's not, because that has to come all the way up to infinity so that you can use the mega ohm meter, because m times 1, are we in frame? Yeah, we're in frame. Close enough to it anyway. With this setting on mx times 1, the idea is to set this voltage control so that we're at infinity, and then when you connect on the circuit, it drags the voltage down and gives you a mega ohm reading. That appears to not be working correctly. and I don't know if I should attribute that to the switch or if some of the resistors are out of tolerance. That turns on the oscillator for the quick test. I'm not surprised that drops things a little bit. Okay, so we're gonna have to do some more investigation. At least we know that the on the standard leakage test, at least we know we're getting our 600 volts out of the power supply. Actually, they rated it 550 volts. So the fact that this is actually going to 600 bodes well for the transformer and the 6L6 tube. I'll have to check the meter calibration, see if the meter's actually any good, or actually in calibration. There's a bunch of resistors in here. All right, we're going to find out how good the voltmeter is on this and see if it's even close. I'm on the low volt scale, and this is saying about 210. My meter over here, my Keithley, is reading 212. So not bad. If I go up to the high volts, that says 600, that says 635 over there, so I'm happy. That's close enough for the purpose of testing electrolytic caps. We don't have to be within microvolts. So 638 versus 600. Let's push it all the way up to the end and see what it'll produce. Wow, I'm amazed. 692 volts, so almost 700 volts. So that's fairly healthy. That means the power supply in this thing is in pretty good shape. Now that's very severely current limited. I have come across here and been bit, and of course I'm doing this one-handed. Oh yeah, there's a pretty good tingle there. But it's very current limited. I wouldn't do that with both hands. That's a good way to get seriously hurt. So 640 volts right now it's reading over there, and 600. We were off to scale. Let's put this exactly on 600. Exactly on 600. There we go. 636. Close enough. Close enough. And I'm going to have to eat my words about the high-low range being a gimmick. I figured out why they've done that. This is actually surprisingly accurate. I didn't expect it to be at all. But when that's on 30, that's just reading a whisker above 300. 40 is just a whisker above 400, so on all the way up to 60, which is pretty much dead on 600 volts. It's amazing. However, when you come all the way down this way, it won't go any lower than 10, because now you're into the switch. Now I'm going to be shutting the unit off. So at 10, it's reading 100 volts. If you want to measure or check a capacitor that's under 100 volts, now you got to switch to the low range and then use the meter exclusively. So there's 100 volts, there's 50, 40, 20, and so on. So you can get this down to about, well, you can go lower than that, but you can't read what it is on that scale. But there's 20 volts, and we're reading 18 volts on the Keithley. Actually, if I put a dead on line, now it's reading 20.44, and this is dead on 20 volts. So let's go dead on 40 volts, 41.6. Come up here exactly on 100, 103. That's why they have the low volt range, so you can actually test low voltage capacitors, because on the high volt range you're limited to 100 volts minimum before you get into the off switch. The 5 is meaningless because it's off after that point. But that's enough for tonight. We don't want this video to turn into a 3-hour marathon, and it's going to take some time to straighten this thing out, take it apart, get it cleaned up. I'm fairly comfortable now, I guess, that I can go ahead and start doing the cosmetic work on it, because it appears that at least the power supply section of it's good. It appears that most of the functions are trying to work, and I suspect because of the leaky capacitors that remain in here, And I'm hoping against hope that that switch is in good shape. Now it appears to be making good, it doesn't appear to have noisy contacts. It's working well. It sounds crunchy, but everything physically seems okay. We'll check a bunch of resistors to make sure they're in tolerance. We'll go through the rest of the capacitors and get those changed out. And if everything looks good, then we'll go ahead and do the cosmetics. That's it for this evening. I'm the radio mechanic, and hopefully we'll get this guy back up and running and prove that they could do 10 gig ohm tests. Well, we proved it with the old CE. And, if you go back and look at that video, you can see I'm holding the test leads, and it was measuring what was, it could see the leakage through the rubber. At any rate, I'm the radio mechanic. That's enough for tonight. I'm getting tired, and that's when you get hurt, so when you play with this stuff tired. So I'm going to call it an evening. See you again soon, I hope. Bye.